Good afternoon. I'm Roberta Scholz, the director of Bridwell Library, and I am very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's Bridwell Library lecture given by Dr. Susanne Scholz, entitled God's Word is Man's Word? The Politics of Translating the Sacred Texts of Christianity and Judaism. Dr. Scholz is an associate professor of Old Testament at Perkins, and her scholarly interests are in Hebrew Bible, biblical studies, women, gender, and feminist theory and religion, and interfaith dialogue. She is a prolific writer. 3 of her recent books are titled Sacred Witness, Rape in the Hebrew Bible, Introducing the Women's Hebrew Bible, and Biblical Studies, Alternatively, an Introductory Reader. Dr. Scholz is also a popular speaker and regularly delivers lectures at academic conferences as well as in church and other educational settings. Among the topics she has lectured on are Eve and Adam in the 21st Century, Bible and Yoga, and Prophetic Visions of Economic Justice. The Bridwell Library Lecture Series accompanies our current exhibitions. The exhibition in the Elizabeth Perkins Portrait Galleries this spring is titled 8 Centuries of the Bible in Translation, and it highlights the transmission of the Bible throughout the world in a multitude of languages between the 13th and 19th century. Dr. Scholz would move us forward into the 20th and 21st centuries as she addresses the question of, is it political correctness or linguistic skill that makes for a good Bible translation? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Susanne Scholz.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thank you for taking time out of your busy semester and day and week. I want to state from the beginning, so that you have no doubt in your mind, the struggles over translating the Bible are never merely about linguistics, history, or theology. They are always about assertions of power and authority. When there is a challenge to the status quo, which in terms of Bible translations mainly means to the status quo of Constantinian Christianity, then the emperors of the day become upset. In the 15th and 16th century CE, when the Bible was largely used to uphold power and glory in Europe, vernacular Bible translations were not welcomed, but ridiculed, suppressed, and categorized as heretical. Perhaps you already had a chance to go through the library exhibit and to marvel about the wide range of translations. If you did, perhaps you noticed 2 Bibles in particular for which the curators provided contextual information beyond the name, place, and date of the particular edition. The explanatory notes indicate that one translation from Britain and another from Spain were not approved by the respective political and religious authorities at the time. Let me present the details in both cases because they illustrate the power dynamics in which translations of sacred texts stood in the past. The first Bible is located in the entrance room of the exhibition in the section entitled Bibles of the Middle Ages in Europe. Walk around the glass case to the back and read the explanatory note. It states what you see here on the slide. It's a Middle English New Testament illuminated manuscript on vellum from 1400 to 1425. The first widely circulated version of the scriptures in English, this 14th century translation from St. Jerome's Latin is attributed to followers of John Wycliffe, an English reformer who rejected many church rituals and institutions, preferring the Bible as his sole authority. The popularity of the Wycliffite translation grew rapidly, although it was outlawed in 1407 by the Archbishop of Canterbury, who feared scriptural misinterpretation by lay readers, the erosion of clerical authority, and the propagation of heresy by dissident preachers. This is Bridwell's library's earliest version of the scriptures in any vernacular language. That's what you find down there. I was so happy to find this. because what we learn here is so important. Although this is a New Testament translation from the popular Latin translation of St. Jerome, and hence from a linguistic perspective, this is not what we today consider a top-notch scholarly translation because it is not based on the original Greek text of the New Testament. This particular translation is of considerable religious and political value. After all, we learn that it was the first and a popular translation at its time, and it was outlawed in 1407 by the Archbishop of Canterbury. This Archbishop of Canterbury outlawed this particular translation because he, quote, and now I have the text here on the slide, he feared scriptural misinterpretation by lay readers, the erosion of clerical authority, and the propagation of heresy by dissident preachers. It was at a time when the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishops of Canterbury were in full communion with the See of Rome. Hence, in an effort to keep religious power and control, he acted like Catholic authorities elsewhere. It was a brute act of force within one particular context of Constantinian, that is, state-empowered Christianity. The exhibition presents a second case to us. You find it in the section entitled Bible of the Reformation in Europe in the third room. A Spanish Bible translation of the mid-16th century is accompanied by this note. Spanish New Testament, El Nuevo Testamento de nuestro Redemptor y Suyo Salvador Jesucristo, traducido de griego en castellano. That's my Spanish. The first edition of the scriptures in Castilian Spanish, this New Testament was translated from the Greek by Francisco de Enzinas, who dedicated the work to Emperor Charles V, in the hope, this is important, of gaining official approval for circulation within Spain. However, you've got to love this. Catholic censors found the translation highly objectionable, and in 1551 it was placed on the first Spanish index of prohibited books. In other words, in one of the power centers of the Catholic Church in Spain, after the heydays of the Protestant Reformation were over, the Catholic censors chose a no-fuss approach. They quickly moved this Bible edition onto the censorship table, and 8 years after its publication, the first Spanish Bible became a prohibited book. Even the conciliatory nod to the emperor did not help. Despite the dedication to the king, the Bible was placed on the first Spanish index of prohibited books. So please look for this Spanish translation of 1543 and ponder the fact that these and many other Bible translations threatened religious authorities that often enjoyed considerable political power. Textual details or hermeneutical issues remained unimportant in these encounters. It came down to outright oppression. But ultimately, this repression did not succeed. Today, we take vernacular Bibles for granted, and the Catholic Church reads from them too. We need to remember that Bible translations are related to assertions of power and authority, because even today, religious authorities make trouble for those Bible translators who challenge the status quo with their translations. As in the past, the scene is not pretty, even though the Bible in itself is not read anymore in Western societies as leading shapers of politics, economics, and culture. I'm, of course, talking about the responses that inclusive Bible translations get from religious institutions and their followers, and sometimes even from secular commentators. Interestingly, the debate about inclusive Bible translations takes for granted that Bibles are published in the vernacular languages of the place in which they are read. Thus, we need to recognize that today's disagreements over Bible translations do not consist over whether or not the Bible should be translated into the vernacular. This was the dispute of the 15th and 16th centuries. Today, the dispute is over what kind of vernacular language the Bible should be translated into. The debate is quite nuanced, although it too is loaded with disagreements over politics, power, and authority. This is so because many do not know important hermeneutical principles, which are the foundation of all translation work. The first hermeneutical principle asserts, and I see some students here and they know this first translation principle very well, all translations are interpretations. And a second hermeneutical principle follows on its heels. The meanings of sacred texts, such as the Bible, are shaped by the reader's convictions about gender, race and ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, geopolitical location, culture, religion, and history. Or stated in a more abstract way, the meanings people give to sacred texts, such as the Bible, are epistemological, sociological, political, economic, and religious constructs about the world. Many people today continue to believe that it is just a matter of translating the Bible historically and linguistically accurate to get to the intended meaning in the target language. Although this hermeneutical idea has been dismantled inside and outside of biblical studies for the past 40 to 50 years or so, it takes many people often a long time, usually a semester or two with me, to see a connection, here at Perkins, I mean, of course I'm modest, to see a connection between Bible translations and socio-political, cultural, and religious convictions about the world. I want to briefly note that I'm not inventing all of this. That would be just too much. But the academic field of translation theory has developed a sophisticated understanding about the connections among translations, translators, and their contexts and convictions. The influential translation theorist Lawrence Venuti analyzed the process within which a text is translated from a source language into a target language. He has shown that translators play the central role in this process. They decide whether a translation serves to stabilize the status quo or to resist a homogeneous adaptation into the context of the target language. Consequently, Venuti observes that translations are, quote, embedded within the new social context, and there they can challenge cultural and political institutions and reveal the shaky foundations of these institutions' social authority, end quote. According to Venuti, a challenge to the status quo may occur when the target language foreignizes the translation from the socio-political, economic, and cultural conventions. In short, the contemporary debate over inclusive Bible translations is so explosive because inclusive Bible translations engage in the ongoing symbolic battle over how we ought to live in the world today. Jewish theologian Mark Ellis would perhaps call it a battle for the prophetic in Bible translations. At stake is whether we stay within the status quo or whether we envision an alternative order. In this sense, then, the debate over inclusive Bible translations manifests our collective imaginary about the kind of world in which we want to live and of what kind of world we hope to leave to our children and our children's children. When we choose to read this or that translation at home, in the pews, in the classroom, or in public spaces, we take sides on the symbolic level. We practice symbolically our vision for the world and the future. Hence, similar to the Reformation age in the 15th and 16th centuries, today's struggle over inclusive Bible translations is not merely theoretical. It signifies a way of shaping the world today and in the future. As such, it is not surprising that it is a very serious and mightily contested business. In my view, the struggle over inclusive Bible translations comes down to two fundamental choices. One, Do we read the Bible toward a future in which language about God and God's people takes for granted the current power arrangements, our practices of social class, gender, race, ethnicity, and geopolitics? And thus, for instance, do we accept to speak of God as Lord, Father, King, and Master? Or do we choose to express in our reading of the Bible our hope for the world that promotes a social, political, economic, and religious vision that is not limited by contemporary structures of domination and seeks inclusive language patterns, fostering and embracing equality, justice, and peace? These are the two fundamental sides in the debate on inclusive Bible translations today. They have major repercussions for society, for our interactions with each other individually and collectively, and our future goals as religious communities and as a society. Depending on our position, we either defend the social, political, economic, and religious status quo, or we challenge it and envision alternative ways of living in the world. Allow me to move from the abstract to the concrete. Due to the limited time, I want to focus on one example. It relates to the issue of gender, but this does not mean that there are not many other examples in the inclusive Bible translation debate that deal with issues of race and class and religion and geopolitics. It is just that this particular example bothers me a lot, and I would like you to be bothered as well. Then I feel less lonely, and that's a good thing. My example shall be the popular and usually mindlessly repeated word, Lord, that many people use for God. According to the canonical order of the Bible, the occasion to say Lord for God presents itself for the first time in Genesis 2:4b, which the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV, translates like this: in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. The question is, why Lord? Well, the story is pretty simple. There is no reason for it on the basics of linguistics. End of story. But this is not where it ends. After all, the great majority of Bible translations use the noun Lord for God here and in all the other cases with the same wording in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. So this is what is going on in Hebrew. The Hebrew text uses the word Yod-Heh-Veh whenever you see the capitalized Lord in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew noun is transliterated as YHWH, or pronounced as Yahweh, or based on a misunderstanding in the Middle Ages as Jehovah, which combines the Hebrew vowels of Adonai with Yahweh into Jehovah. Adonai means my Lord. We inherited the convention from the ancient rabbis who did not say out loud the tetragrammaton, the four consonants of Yahweh, YHWH. Instead, they suggested alternatives, and the most prominent one is Adonai, my Lord. This noun substitutes the tetragrammaton, alas, with an androcentric, a male-centered slant, although it does not contain any hint of gender or class. Many scholars derive the Yod-Heh-Veh, Yahweh, from the Hebrew word Haya, to be. This connection is most prominently evident in Exodus 3:14, where God's name appears as Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I am who I am, or I am what I am, or I will be what I will be, or I am who I will be. Because Hebrew has very different understanding of tense. And the relative pronoun can be who and that, both ways. The editors of the NRSV note when they make that translation in Exodus 3:14, quote, all three names, Asher, Ehyeh, Asher, Ehyeh, all three names are ambiguous, as is appropriate to the mysteriousness of Israel's God, though they may emphasize God's eminence. What this and other explanatory notes leave unsaid is the fact that the Hebrew noun does not entail any gender or class concept. Or said more simply, The word Yahweh does not imply in any way any notion about maleness and class hierarchy. In fact, it signifies just the opposite. No gender and no hierarchy, but the idea of becoming, being, fluidity, and ambiguity or flexibility. So why do we collectively insist on using Lord for God in prayers, sermons, classrooms, teachings, and many other speaking situations? Let me suggest that it is not because the Bible tells us so. Rather, this convention is grounded in androcentrism and class hierarchy. It is an issue of authority and power. Yet alternatives exist and have been proposed. Let me show you what 3 inclusive translations propose for Genesis 2, verse 4b. First, the contemporary Torah, a gender-sensitive adaptation of the JPS translation, edited by David Stein in consultation with renowned Jewish Bible scholars, and it was published in 2006 by the Jewish Publication Society. It translates the verse in Genesis 4 like this: When God, Yod-Heh-Veh, the Hebrew, made earth and heaven. No translation, in other words, representation of the Hebrew consonants. The editors explain in the introduction that they decided to represent the name of God untranslated in unvocalized Hebrew letters. This, and I'm quoting, this styling enables the word to function as a name without limiting the conception of God to a single quality. The untranslated representation of Yahweh is applied throughout this Torah. Lord is eliminated in it. There is a second inclusive Bible, the one translated by the Priests for Equality and first published in 2005. The Priests for Equality describe themselves as, quote, a movement of women and men throughout the world, laity, religious, and clergy, who work for the full participation of women and men in church and society. The inclusive Bible they offer translates Genesis 2, 4b in the following way. At the time when Yahweh, without the vowels, made the heavens and the earth. This translation might run into trouble only from those opposing to speak out loud the unpronounceable name for God. It also changed the word order of earth and heavens, but it too eliminated Lord from the surface of the translation. Then third, there is the recently published and first German inclusive Bible translation called Bibel in gerechter Sprache and best translated as Bible in just language. Published in 2005, this translation aims to take care of inclusive language issues related to, as the editors explain, the issue of justice. One of them elaborated, quote, more specifically, the new inclusive Bible translation is sensitive to 3 forms of justice: gender justice, the Jewish-Christian dialogue, and social justice that relates to the circumstances of biblical times, which are often romanticized in other German language translations, end quote. The sensitivity to issues of gender, religious, and social justice made the editorial team decide to consider the proper name of God as untranslatable, in line with the rabbinic tradition that did not say out loud the name of God, substituting it with Adonai. And this is exactly what they did for this particular verse in Genesis 2. On the day that Adonai, which is the name of God, created earth and heaven. A special feature of this translation is that the header, when you have the Bible open, on the header of the left page, alternative names for God appear. And these are, first in German, but I read only in English. Adonai, the living, which in German they chose the feminine noun. I am here, you. Hamakom, which is Hebrew for the place, another rabbinic tradition. He, she, and the Holy One. So every page in the Hebrew Bible has on the left top these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 alternatives for God. Whenever we have the Tetragrammaton, you can use that these particular alternatives. But in Genesis 2, verse 4b, the translators chose Adonai, which ironically is a term sensitive to issues related to the Christian dialogue, but not to gender. It means my Lord, but in Hebrew. So many people who read that German inclusive translation don't read Hebrew, but now they learn that term that in Hebrew is again an androcentric and class hierarchical term. Yet due to the flexibility in the header, alternatives can easily become part of the next reading. That is at least the idea of the editors. So the situation seems pretty clear for this particular verse, and one must ask, why do so many insist on using Lord for God when the linguistic evidence in the Hebrew Bible does not indicate this androcentric and hierarchical meaning? In a nutshell, in this case, our translation preference reflects our collectively ingrained indifference to androcentric and class structures of domination, even when we speak about God. There is firmness and confidence in this repetitive insistence that does not care about linguistic accuracy. Established arrangements about power and authority, about tradition, about politics, of gender and class reinforce our speech. Of course, people who use an androcentric and class hierarchical title for God reverse their argument just as easily when there is a case of male specificity that seems to challenge androcentric conventions. Not the consistency of the argument is important, but the preservation of a certain worldview, a certain symbolic order of human life on planet Earth. Very, very briefly, I want to illustrate this dynamic with Hosea 11:9c. In this verse, male specificity turns into a generic human condition in most translations. Here is the English translation of the NRSV. It says, "For I am God and no mortal." This translation of Hosea 11:9c insinuates a familiar and acceptable contrast between God and humanity. Most famously, the 20th century Protestant and Swiss theologian Karl Barth characterized God as the totally other from humanity. In fact, he mentioned Hosea 11:9c in support of his theological position. Thus, to him and his numerous students, this verse celebrated the unbridgeable gulf between humanity and the divinity. So why am I making a fuss about this? Well, listen to the German inclusive Bible translation, which I have translated already into English. It says, "For God am I and not a male." It's underneath that second one. At stake is the noun ish. Should it be translated as mortal, human, or as male for man? Interestingly, in another key passage in which this noun appears, it is always translated in one and only one fashion. In Genesis 2:23, all translations that I know of translate the noun ish like this: "For out of man this one was taken." In Genesis 2:23, which is the second creation story of the earthling and then Adam and Eve coming out of the earthling, in Genesis 2:23, this noun is always translated in a gender-specific way, referring to man as in male. But not when the same noun appears in Hosea 11:9c. Only when feminist Bible scholars entered the scene in the 70s did they make clear that the noun can be translated as a reference to males and be contrasted to the divinity. Thus understood, the prophetic text contrasts God and males, not all of humanity. Let me complicate the situation just a little bit further. I have 2 more minutes and I need them. Some Christian rights translators affirm the feminist observation when they deal with yet another text, Psalm 1. They say, yes, ish refers to a man and should not be translated into a plural noun such as "blessed are those who not walk in the counsel of the wicked." They translate Psalm 1:1 as gender specific. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked. To such Christian conservative translators, and that's of course not limited to Christian conservative translators, but they make that point most recently, the masculine singular noun is preferable because it stands in contrast to the many wicked people. They assert that, quote, nothing in the immediate context overturns the instinct to assign tentatively the meaning the man, and to think first of all of a male human being rather than a female, end quote. One of these interpreters, Vern Poitras, even explains that, quote, the readers must determine from the larger context whether the sex of the same person functions to qualify the range of application in the sentence, and so the starting point is the picture of one, and that one is male, end quote. In short, Christian right translators make a strong case for translating ish as a gender-specific noun when it appears in Psalm 1:1. Yet when the same noun appears in Hosea 11:9c, they change their position and insist that the noun refers now to humanity in general and no longer to the male. Let me conclude. Translations of the Bible are never politically innocent projects. They are value-laden, politically, socially, and theologically charged statements about power and authority. Translations force readers to take a public stance and to declare what they perhaps would prefer to hide. Do our Bible readings endorse the status quo, the manifold structures of domination in society in the world? Or do our Bible readings envision an alternative world that is built on equality, justice, and peace? Thus, the issue is not how did the original authors intend the text to be read, or what does it mean grammatically, or let's just follow the tradition. At stake is where we stand in the world, what our politics are, what our ethics are, and how we imagine life on earth. Inclusive Bible translations give witness to this ongoing symbolic struggle we face even today. They challenge established patterns and practices of power and authority. They expose certain patterns of injustice, oppression, exploitation, and they aim to foster an alternative. Thus, depending on which translation we read, money might change hands, political approval might be withdrawn, cultural support might be given to someone else, and religious practices might be revised. This is why inclusive Bible translations make people nervous and why they matter even today. This is true when the debate turns to gender, and it is also true when it comes to post-colonial implications of Bible readings in Asia, Africa, and elsewhere. Our exhibition celebrates vernacular Bible translations, but let's be honest about it. Much blood has been spilled, many lives been lost, and much human potential has been destroyed because of these translations. Those who are Christians among us, and all of us who live in a country profoundly shaped by Western colonial forces, inherit a complex history that is part of our society and religious tradition. Once we realize these complex historical and religious implications of Bible translations, we understand that even privatized, personalized, and sentimentalized approaches to the Bible are political because they take side on the symbolic level, on the symbolic political level. Such is the power of reading the Bible, even in the 21st century. So please choose your translation carefully the next time you read the sacred text of Judaism and Christianity. Thank you very much.
We have time for some questions, if anyone would like to ask questions of Dr. Holmes.
John.
I have a kind of personal example of exactly what you're talking about. I was the editor of the Psalms and Canticles in the United Methodist Symbol of 1989. In 1985, when we began that work, retranslating the Psalms, our attempt was to have an inclusive translation. And so our first indication, I suggested first that we use the tetragrammaton every time it came up, so that one could contrast that with these parallel phrases where the word God appeared in the second line. So this was a very nice way, it seems to me, of doing it. When I brought that to the main committee, that was imminently rejected instantaneously, because they simply refused to imagine that anybody would ever read such a thing or could read such a thing out loud. So they decided they would use Lord in the way that you just described, in that sort of way. Well, it's not really inclusive. And they said, well, we're going to do that. But then it got even worse, because the next step was to bring it to the larger Committee of General Conference. And they said that if you put those words Lord in there to replace the male pronouns that were in the line, they would reject the whole thing. And so when you read the United Methodist Hymnal now, the pronouns are back in there. And it was over my dead and dying body. And I must admit, I feel a great failure when I was not able really to do the thing that we had first decided to do now 25 years ago. I think exactly what you're saying is a very real and quite clear reality.
I have a lot of questions, but the one I'm going to ask is this. I'm trying to decide which question to ask. But one thing that I think illustrates what you're talking about is the later translation of the Chinese translation of John 1:1 in Arche or Logos, where Logos is in fact translated as Tao. So in the beginning was the Tao. And it seems to me that that really disclosed all kinds of possibilities between two cultures. Now, unfortunately, the one we have on exhibit is in fact the earlier translation by Morrison, and that follows the old Latin translation, translating as word, the verbum translation. But in fact, later, I think was actually, well, officially it was done by a Jewish convert to Anglicanism, and then became Bishop of Shanghai. But that's another story. But I think he actually had helps. He had Chinese helps, and somehow found the equivalent of Logos as Tao. And it seems to me that that really ought to be the beginning of a long discussion of how a translation can actually disclose a new set of visions. That may not go with what you're saying about liberating a text from liberation, because that might in fact introduce new moments of oppression. But it does disclose a new vision for readers. And I think you all should learn Chinese and just get the full flavor of this notion of the beginning was the Tao. And more importantly, in 1:14, Tao becoming flesh.
I mean, also in the African context, I have a colleague who works in the Zimbabwean context who examines these colonial missionary effects of Bible translations into the Shona language. It's all connected, whether you focus on gender or in this case on geopolitics. I mean, if you accept the first hermeneutical principle that my students must accept when they take my class and then they can forget it afterwards, which is all translations are interpretations. Okay, if we